guest on today's episode is Danielle Tigan. Danielle is joining us today to tell a really cool story of an unexpected return to a very small town. Danielle is from the town of Turton, South Dakota, or Turton, South Dakota, depending on how you want to put your emphasis. And she joins us to talk about how that happened. And really it's through remote work being an opportunity, and also then her spouse and like how he ended up finding employment back. It's a very, very cool story. There's a lot of takeaways for those of us that care about the future of our small towns, things that we can be thinking about differently in terms of who might be the next residents. And I would say at this point, if it seems unexpected or like it's not the expected or obvious choice, it's probably definitely something to take a look at. So enjoy this chat with my sweet friend, Danielle Tigan. Hey, Danielle. Welcome to the Growing Small Town Show.
Well, thank you.
Oh, I'm so happy to have you.
I'm happy to be here.
Why don't you start out, we can talk a little bit about where you live, like the size of town that you live in, and then the whole remote employment aspect for sure we want to get into.
Sure.
But tell us a bit about your cute little town in South Dakota.
I live in a very cute, very small town in the northeastern corner of South Dakota. The name of it is Turton, and it's actually where I grew up. So I was raised here, but then I had moved away. I went to college at NDSU and then stayed in Fargo, and now I'm back. We moved back almost 3 years ago, which seems crazy to think that it's been
pretty new returner. I actually didn't know that it was so recent.
Yeah. Well, it's funny how it feels like it's been longer than 3 years, but then it also feels like we just got here, a year ago. So yeah, it's a town of only about 55 people. So it is very small. We have a bank here.
I didn't know it was even that small. I knew it was small.
Yes,
I love it. Oh, this is
small.
Great.
Yeah. So it's tiny. So my kids go to school in another small town 11 miles away, which is about 150 people. So it is a very small area. We are very rural. Everybody, I think, except for us and a few people, they're farmers. So they're farm families. And that's what it's always been. And that's kind of what we liked about it too, is that we liked the idea of raising kids in a really small town.
I love this so much. So let's talk a little bit about professionally what you do. And also, and it's so fun because you and I connected through a conference that you organized in Fargo and that I got to speak at. It was super fun. It was a great conference. So you and I don't know each other that well. So a lot of these things I'm getting to ask you, like, truly, I just so fascinated. So talk a little bit about your profession, like your career. Yep. And then if that, and being able to do it from Turton, if that was the catalyst. And then of course, like what your spouse does too,
right.
Just kind of round that out for us, if you would.
Yeah. So my professional background is I have degrees in journalism and management communication. And after college, I managed a couple of different local magazines. I worked for an engineering company doing PR and marketing for them. I worked for the Chamber in Fargo for a while doing marketing and communications for them. And I came to Forum Communications back in 2015. And I actually started there as a digital content producer, basically writing blogging content for a blogging platform that they had. If you remember Area Voices.
Definitely.
Yes.
I submitted a few, I think. Yeah, I did. Uh-huh.
Yes. And so I was managing that platform and we were trying to create content for that. So we all wrote and things like that too. Well, eventually the features editor position opened up and I was hired for that. And shortly, a couple years after that, then I actually became deputy editor of the Forum, of the newspaper. So I worked in the newsroom then with our news reporting team. And then we decided as a family, so as my father is aging, he is the one currently running the bank, and it's the bank that my family owns. And he's aging and would like to eventually retire, but he didn't have a plan necessarily for how that retirement would happen if he wanted to keep the bank within our family. And so he approached my husband, who was at the time, he had been, I don't think he was still at Eide Bailly, but he worked for Eide Bailly for almost 10 years doing bank valuations. So he was my husband was actually speaking at conferences that my dad was attending. And my husband was talking about, succession planning, the importance of having these plans in place. What do you do if you're buying or selling a bank and things like that? And so my dad approached my husband about whether he'd ever be interested in moving back to, Turton and running the bank for him so that he could retire. And my husband grew up in a small town. He grew up in Rugby, North Dakota, the geographical center of North America.
So yes, they have their fame for sure.
Yes. And he grew up on a farm. And so he's very familiar with, the agricultural landscape that would make up the majority of the clientele at the bank. So he approached my husband, and then we talked about it as a family, and we decided that might be an option for us. Well, this was all happening unbeknownst to us. Then a global pandemic was going to be happening in the near future. And so we had actually thought about whether I would have to quit my job at Forum Communications, because at the time that this was all kind of taking shape, Forum Communications really didn't have a lot of remote employees. There were a few exceptional cases, right? It was like, our capital correspondents who maybe had to, work in St. Paul, but we don't have an office in St. Paul, but they obviously need to be there for, legislative news and things like that. And so I actually thought I was going to have to quit my job because I just didn't think that would be something they would go for. Well, it turns out then the one good thing because of this global pandemic is that everyone realized you can actually be a remote worker and still get things done, and you don't have to be physically in an office. And so when I talked to my boss at the time about the plan and the move to South Dakota, I said, I would really like to stay with the company. Obviously, being deputy editor wasn't really going to be possible because in that role, you do really need to be in the Fargo-Moorhead community, obviously, to know what's happening. Yeah. So I talked to him and said, is there something else I could do? I think there's a couple of options here with some different projects and some different publications. One being this publication On the Minds of Moms, which started in Fargo-Moorhead area as a locally owned, founded magazine by a couple of moms, and Forum Communications actually purchased it from those founders in 2019. And the plan had been for me to manage that when I came back when the pandemic, because I was actually on maternity leave when the pandemic started. So all of this was going on at the same time. It was just kind of a wild, wild time for a number of reasons. And they said, well, you're a valuable employee and we will do what we can to keep you employed at Forum Communications. So let's go for it. So I became a remote employee that June when we moved back here to South Dakota.
So for our listeners that don't know what Eide Bailly is, it's not even just regional anymore. I mean, it is a multi-state. How many states are there? In a lot of states?
Oh, a lot,
I don't even know, but a lot. But they're an accounting firm.
Yep.
I love everything about, and there's, again, Danielle, the reason I bring people onto this show is to help them think differently about ways that we could be approaching, like what does our Danielle Teigen look like?
Right.
Like that's the question, right? Is like, who are these people? And they're out there. Yeah. Like, so it's a really cool story. I had no idea that it was really your husband. This is similar to my story, at least a little bit, in the sense that like my husband came back to take over my dad's portion of our farm.
Right.
Right. I'm the generation that's carrying the name on or whatever, but it's not my work.
Exactly. Yep.
So it's just very, very cool. Well, and also, I mean, what a story to be dealing with the pandemic, to be expecting another child. Like, oh God, good for you. And you guys made it, and you're like came out on the other side and like, everyone's alive. Everybody's healthy. Like that's a thing, man.
I mean, we barely made it, but we made it.
I get it. Yeah.
I would not recommend coming off maternity leave, changing jobs, and then moving to a new state all within, like a 2-3 month period.
Those
during
are like
a pandemic.
they're like the big life things. And then you did them, you stacked them on top of each other. I did the same. I don't know. There's something about it. I think once you're in it, you're like, whatever.
Right.
Just deal with it. We'll deal with it. It'll be fine. Yep. But what's really cool is I think there's many parts of your story that are cool to me. But I think the fact that like the pandemic did deliver to all of us, to employers especially, a way of retaining people without requiring them to stay right there. Now, I think that's shifting back a little bit. I'm sure you've kind of seen or heard some of these things, right? Like where a completely remote workforce isn't exactly working for everybody. I mean, so we're kind of everyone's figuring out what does a hybrid of this look like now. But what this means for small towns, like, well, I guess I should ask you, I have thoughts about what this means for small towns. What do you think it means? Because you went back to where you grew up.
Yeah.
And I doubt when you left, I'm guessing, I'll ask, when you left Turton, were you like, oh, one day I can't wait to come back here?
Oh, I never thought I would come back.
Okay.
I never did.
That's what I
Nope.
assume, just based on how, what I know of you
Right.
and just professionally, you have professional aims. Like I can see that.
Right.
So what do you think this means? Like the kind of the evolution of remote employment, plus just the advent of all the amazing things that we get to use to do
Right.
business from whatever small corner of the world that we want to.
Right.
What do you think it means for us?
I mean, I think it's exciting because it does open up the opportunities for people. We've talked about at length, it was not common for anyone to be in these small communities, 5 years ago, and for anyone to be working remotely. You were either
Mhm.
employed by the school, you were
Right.
employed by, one of the local businesses, either right, in this area or maybe 20, 30 miles away.
Right.
Or you were a farmer and you were a farm family and that's what you did. And now I'm a remote worker. There is another family where the mom, she was working for a local organization and got a different job working for a company out of Brookings, and she's a remote worker, and that's possible in this day and age. And it's exciting to see that they didn't have to contemplate her losing employment. They didn't have to think about, her trying to find, a job here in the area that she has to physically go to, because those are often limited, obviously, in a small town too,
Mhm.
just based on the industry and the organizations there. And so I think it's really exciting. We've talked at length too when we have teacher openings, just us in the community, we've talked about teacher openings and thinking like there is an opportunity there if a teacher would move here, if that person has a spouse or a significant other who's coming with them and they have an opportunity to remain with their employer and be a remote worker, that facilitates that move in a much smoother way than disrupting their lives or the professional lives and the professional path someone might be on. So I think it's really exciting. I think it's still a little new for some people in the community, or to think that those are really the opening opportunities or the available opportunities for them. But I think we're getting there. And I think the more and more we see things like those of us who are working remotely, I think more and more people will realize, wow, this is possible if we want to live in a smaller community, but we don't want to have to change jobs or give up our jobs or quit working. We don't have to. It's possible to do what we're doing and do what we want to do.
Right. I totally agree that it's still kind of a foreign concept.
Right.
But COVID accelerated that learning.
Mhm.
And I wish that it hadn't taken that. Like, I mean, I wish in a million ways that that hadn't been the thing that like made it so obvious, but it really did. Everybody came home
Mhm.
and suddenly everybody was a remote worker, with air quotes
Right.
around it. Right. And so then like working from home, and like for me, we have this facility that has co-working. Co-working
Yes.
made zero sense. It's just like so many people around here. And now it makes sense because they
Mhm.
understand remote employment. Okay. The other thing that I think is I would love to actually have you frame this out for our potential audience, right? Again, all sorts of different people listen to this podcast. I mean, sometimes it's people in community and economic development.
Sure.
Sometimes it's just literally people trying to do cool stuff in their small towns. Like that's the audience I always speak to, because you don't have to have a title to like
Right.
be an impassioned person, right? But let's talk a little bit about, again, now this is a little different because it was your dad recruiting his son-in-law.
Yes.
But let's talk a little bit about the value of personal recruitment. Like personally, again, your dad wouldn't necessarily, okay, I'm going to make an assumption here and you check me if I'm wrong on this,
Okay.
Danielle, but like if he hadn't been in a position to see your husband presenting on these things that he was like completely attuned to,
Yep.
he wouldn't have necessarily just gone straight to your husband and been like, I think you should come back and run our bank.
Right. Oh, for
Right.
sure. Yeah.
So the relationship wasn't the primary indicator. It
Right.
was him being in a situation where he saw his talent, he saw the way he thinks, and he started to see things line up. Is that fair?
Right. Yes. Yep.
Okay. And again, the reason I say it is because every single one of us in small communities, we meet people
Yep.
along the way. And I think sometimes we're like we're not capitalizing on those opportunities to say, gosh, I can't get this out of my head. Like I'm watching you speak about these things.
Yep.
And I can't help but think how aligned it is with this opportunity back home.
Right.
Like, can you talk a little bit about that? Like what was the conversation for your spouse? Because leaving Ide Bailey is a big deal too.
Yeah.
You guys didn't leave, like it wasn't like simple jobs to replace.
Right.
Like it's a big deal, the
Right.
leap that you both made.
And yeah, we had to have a very frank conversation because obviously having grown up here, I know what is here and what it's
Right.
like living in a small community. And, and we both really enjoyed Fargo where we were
Mhm.
living at the time. We weren't, and we've still told people, as we've come back and encounter people, they've been like, oh, you didn't like living in a big city, right? And we said, no, that
You're
was
like,
not
that's
it
not
at
it.
all. We
Right.
loved Fargo. We loved
Mhm.
everything about it, but we saw something else and thought that would be better for our family and for, us as individuals too. So yeah. And I think too, the relationship, there was a lot of discussion even over the course of several years where, my dad, I think he would kind of test the waters a little bit to see where we were because we had always talked about living in a small town and raising a family in a small town. When we first got married and were looking at houses, we actually thought we should maybe look at houses in Kindred or Castleton, Mapleton.
Yep, the little. So again, for
Yeah,
people listening that aren't familiar with those are the bedroom communities outside of
yes,
Fargo Moorhead.
right. All within
Yeah.
about, 20, 30
Yep.
minutes. So we could have still lived in worked in Fargo, but we would have lived in a smaller community with
Mhm.
smaller school systems where kids,
Mhm.
would have maybe gone to school. And we didn't end up having kids, for 5 years into our marriage. So that wasn't a huge issue right away, but this was always something we had thought about. It just had to be at the right time, and when my dad approached, my husband about it, and then, my husband Kevin came to me and said, well, what do we think about this? It happened to be at the right time. We didn't know the global pandemic was coming. So
Oh, for
that,
sure.
could be argued that perhaps it wasn't the best time, but, we got through it. And so, yeah, it was certainly the relationship, but also, yeah, it was that barometer over the years of kind of gauging our temperature. And then us too, as a couple talking about what did we want and what did we see for our future and for our family. I remember being on maternity leave with my daughter who is now 6. And I remember,
And your daughter this was your second?
yes, so she was my
Okay.
second.
Okay. Just
Yeah.
just clarifying, but
Oh,
yeah.
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 Yeah. So this would have been, 6 years ago when I was on maternity leave with her. And I remember telling my husband, I don't know that I want to go to an office 40 hours a week, every week, all day. I'm not sure if that's for me. I think I want to be maybe more flexible or I want to be more part time when my kids are at that age where I want to spend a lot of time with them, And so these were conversations that we'd had, over the course of many years to finally arrive at an opportunity that we said, hey, this does line up with what we've always talked about and what we've
Mhm.
envisioned in our lives.
Mhm. The other question I'm like dying to ask you is, as a journalist,
Hmm.
and this is like unrelated to remote employment, like it's legitimately unrelated to like the arc of the story as we've discussed so far, but I think you're back in this. I mean, again, like it doesn't really, for a township, it doesn't really get a lot smaller than 55 people. I mean,
Right.
am I right about
That's
that?
true.
Like, it just doesn't seem.
That's
And
fair.
people listening would be like, "Forget you, we have 10." Like, whatever. It gets smaller. I
Right.
understand, but like, that's a very very small town, Danielle. And like,
Correct. Yes.
you were just in my town like a few weeks ago with some
Yeah.
girlfriends, and there's a big difference between Turton and my community. Like in terms
Yes.
of like what's available and stuff. There's just quite a bit more people here, right?
Right.
So I
Yep.
understand that small is a very relative thing. But as a journalist, what do you think are the biggest things that those of us that are trying to make our small towns great, what should we be thinking about? What should we be doing? Like, from a journalistic perspective, this is a completely unfair question, friend, because I didn't like prep you with this, but I'm just
Yep.
wondering, what can we do to kind of take back our story? Because Turton
Right.
has a story. You guys
Yep.
are a part of that story.
Right.
And I just don't think we're naturally that given to this. Like, we're not that good at it.
Right. Yeah. I think honestly, the whole reason I wanted to go into journalism as a profession is because I wanted to tell really interesting stories. And I think that every small town, no matter where you are, if you were in South Dakota, if you're in North Dakota, Minnesota, California, New York,
Yeah.
wherever,
Right.
all small towns have interesting stories to tell collectively about their town, about their history, but then they're also so full of really interesting people doing interesting things, and I just think that's the part that we are not good at sharing all the time with people about, what is happening here in this small town. What's happening in your small town? Tell people about it. Share with people about it. Last year, actually, the Forum newsroom, and I still know kind of what's happening with the newsroom, what they're kind of working on. I still know a lot of what's happening in the Fargo-Moorhead area. And there were a lot of stories coming out of like kind of that resurgence of small businesses after the pandemic was kind of not officially over, but kind of the worst of it was over. And there were a lot of stories coming out about these small businesses that had emerged and, were being successful. And last summer, I realized that there is a woman here in Turton who operates a jelly business. And she's been doing this since 1999. And she goes to different vendor shows all over the area, including in Fargo-Moorhead. And I talked to her and said, hey, can I come out to your operation? I lived here, I grew up here, you were operating, but I've never been to her jelly house where she actually does this work. I've never seen this. Can I come out there and just see what you're doing so I can maybe write a story about it? I said, I don't know if the Forum will want to run it, but I think it's an interesting story. Can I come out there? So I went out there one morning. She took me through everything. My mom actually came with me because she'd also never seen anything that happens in the jelly house.
Okay,
I mean, it's like
quick
3 miles from town.
Can we just even just talk about that? Like that I think is, again, when I think about like, what are the practical things that we can take from this conversation?
Right.
That's one of them.
Yeah.
Like explore your own backyard a little bit.
Right.
And I'm not shaming you and your mom, but it's crazy to me to think that your mom had never been there.
Right. Oh, and we said that too. I mean, we stood in this operation going, how is it possible we didn't understand the magnitude of what you're doing, the scope of everything, and
that's cool.
Yeah. So I went home, I wrote a story about it. I sent it off to, the editor and just said, hey, I wrote this. It doesn't have anything to do with parenting, which is like my area, with the Forum that I manage. Yep. But I said, this is just kind of an interesting story. And I think your readers might be interested in it. And he said, yeah, this is great. They ended up putting it on the front page of the paper this Saturday. And the Forum, is only printed 2 days a week now.
Yeah. So can we again, quick, just to like put this into perspective, the Forum is a big freaking deal in North Dakota.
Right.
Again, people listen to this. They're from all over do you know what the circulation is of the Forum?
I haven't heard the numbers for so long.
I know I'm putting you on the spot, but trying to give people some context, but it legitimately is the largest.
Yes.
Well, for sure, the largest newspaper outlet in our entire state. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, it's still the largest newspaper in North Dakota, but then we also reach, North Dakota. We have a presence in North Dakota, Minnesota, South Dakota, Wisconsin, and Iowa. So
okay, I only wanted to say that because again, like it really illustrates that I think, Danielle, and like you tell me what you think, but like I really believe that people want these truly like juicy, connective, feel good. They're feel good stories, but there's stories of hope. There's stories of grit. There's stories of, perseverance. Like the idea that a jelly lady, I mean, the whole thing, I love everything about this story, frankly, like, and it hits the front page of the paper. Now, granted, like you had an in.
Yes. And that was advantageous, obviously, but they didn't have to actually put it in the printed paper. I gave it to them several days before they were even putting that paper together, but they also saw, the value in putting that in the paper, especially for the readers who do still subscribe to a physical copy of the paper, for those who are getting the digital paper. And Shar, the owner, they put it in the paper the same weekend that the Island Park Vendor Fair was going on, which Shar was attending.
Yeah, fun.
And they came home just over the moon saying, we had so many people who stopped by the booth to get jellies from us because they saw it in the paper. And I said, are you serious? I mean, I didn't know that was like, I wasn't doing it to try to help sales or anything. I just wanted to tell this interesting story. And they were like, yeah, but everyone said they loved reading about the story. So they had to find me at the fair, and they did. So
I literally could not love that more. And I think, so then it's like, you're like in the journalism business. So I want to ask you, how do we go about getting those stories told, getting them magnified? If let's say our community doesn't have a paper,
right?
How do we get the attention of a news outlet? Like, what do we do? Like, give us a few ideas maybe on how we could navigate that. Cause I think it's actually really special.
Mm-hmm. It is. And I think too, so where I live, we don't have a community newspaper, but we have a countywide newspaper. And I have honestly pitched a few things to them and said, hey, obviously I know how to do this because I've been pitched to for years and years too, but
Huh?
it's always, the biggest thing is always making some kind of a personal connection about why the story is interesting and why it would be good for those readers to read that story or hear that story, see the story, whatever it is. If you're pitching it to, a TV station, whatever it is, but you have to make sure that they understand the value of it. Not just that you think it's a good story, but why you think other people will find it to be an interesting story. What would they gain from it? Making it clear to the person you're pitching it to is probably the most important thing. The other thing that sometimes people don't realize is that it's helpful for us as those being pitched to know, what are the visual opportunities? Because people want that visual
Sure.
element to the story. So whether it's, the video opportunity, whether it's some photos, and if you have the photos, great, more and more because everyone is kind of spread thin, trying to cover a lot, do a lot of stuff. We don't necessarily always have time to go out and cover an event or get photos at an event. But if someone is willing to share photos because it's an interesting story and we're going to write about it, we'd love to do that, So I think it's making clear, why the story is important, why it matters, but then also trying to help make the job of that person just a tiny bit easier if that's what it's going to take,
Right.
to get it done.
Right. That's all. Oh, that's so good. And I want to say from my perspective in Oaks, we have been able to get Fargo based media
Mhm.
to Oaks a lot.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I think everybody in a small community, again, regardless of where you are, if you're in North Dakota, if you're not, doesn't matter.
Right.
If you think, well, like, why would they care? Do you know why they care? Because they have an entire, like, they have such a slate of content to fill. Like TV stations, newspapers, they need content.
Right.
So
All the time.
all the time. It's never ending. Every single day, those poor reporters or journalists or whomever it might be,
Right.
they're literally scouring, looking for these stories.
Well, right. Yeah.
So I think we just need to maybe stop discounting the value of what we have to
Right.
offer to. And
Well-
like the tips that you gave help a ton. Like you got to make it personal.
Yeah.
You've got to make it, and if you can make it easy for them to tell it, all the
Right.
better, right?
Yeah. Well, and like you said too, I think media organizations are also realizing that people are interested in that feel good story, or the feel good news. We get enough of the hard news and the bad
Now
headlines and stuff like that.
they have a plethora of that. to
Right.
choose
We
from.
don't need that
Right.
anymore. But, and the thing too is that even if you don't currently live in a small town, if you've ever been to a small town, if you know people from a small town, you will see those people or you will see those things in the stories that you read or see,
Mhm.
And I think that that's always fun too, that if a story resonates with a reader or with a viewer because they know somebody in a town like that or they have been to a town like that, we all feel connected to that then. And maybe we
Right.
weren't expecting to.
Right. Oh, it's so good. So, gosh, I love talking with you. I do. I mean, you're such a delightful person. I knew that I would. It's great. But as we kind of naturally come to our end, when you think about let's talk for a moment to the people. Again, the people that might be contemplating moving to a small town might not be the ones listening to this podcast, right? But the people that want those people to come to their communities, those are the people that we're talking to. Right? They're the ones that say, how do we get our Danielle of our own back here? What should we be doing? What should we be thinking about? What are your thoughts about that? Because it's a really special story. I think your story is special.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is special too. And we've certainly received that kind of positive feedback, since moving back here about how unheard of it might be. But that's the thing. We don't want it to be that unheard of. We want people to realize that, going to a small town, living in a small town, it is really special because, you just get to know people on a different level and you feel things on a different level because there's this, there's an incredible sense of ownership and, this really important communal fabric that runs through a small town, and I'm not saying that, bigger cities don't have that as well, but it's a little bit different because the scale is so much smaller. So it feels more intimate and it feels more personal to everybody who's a part of it. And I think when it comes to getting people to think about living in a small town, moving to a small town,
or returning if
if
they
giving
were
it a
originals.
shot.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
I think it's emphasizing the fact that you can have a really full, rich life in a
Mhm.
small town, just like you can in a big city. And if you are looking for something that's different and is going to be a very unique experience, a small town will certainly give you that because I mean, small towns are full of really interesting people. It's just no matter where you go, you know,
100%.
it's going to be an interesting experience. And, you know, I think it's just something that people don't realize. I think they think that small towns are a thing of the past and that, you know, that they're dying, that small towns are dying, you know,
Right.
and I hate that idea of that final ultimate end being associated with small towns because I don't think that's true at all. I think a lot of small towns are vibrant and thriving, fun communities. They may not have a lot of people, but that doesn't mean that that community isn't still there. It's not going to
Absolutely.
cease, you know?
Well,
And
and
I
I
think
think
that's important.
along with this, and again, I say this a lot, it's like if you really value making an impact, like if
Mhm.
that's a thing that's important to you, you know,
Right.
you want to put your stamp on something, however
Right.
that might look. And again, like this newest, youngest generation of workers coming into our workforce, they're very purpose driven
Right.
and like socially conscious, which
Yes.
can be challenging for the older generations to kind of like wrap their brains around. But I think that is something to really leverage
Right.
because I mean, there's no, I mean, you talk about, I always say same rock, bigger ripple, you know,
Yep.
like, because in a small town, there's just like your impact. If you show up and you're full on giving something that's amazing,
Yep.
that the impact of that can be felt just deeper and wider.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Oh,
And so it's
100%.
amazing. Right. I don't, do you feel like you've experienced that being back?
Oh, yeah. And that was actually one of the things that we talked about when we talked about why we would even want to move to a small town, specifically to this small town too, because, you know, Kevin and I were both involved in some organizations in the Fargo-Moorhead area and we really loved them. We just felt like sometimes we were just another volunteer. We were just, you
Mhm.
know, another person, you know, to sit on a committee or what have you. And we said, you know, if you move to a small town like Churton, you become not really like a big fish in a small pond, but you can have more of an impact. And we talked about that. You know, if you sit on the school board of a small
Mhm.
rural community,
Mhm.
you will certainly have an impact. And obviously you can have an impact in larger school systems too, but there's just something more intimate about the experience when it's a smaller community. And we've certainly felt like that. We also realized that as the newest members of the community, we kind of got a bullseye put on our back. So we got asked to sit on,
Oh,
to
yeah.
do all sorts of things, like be involved in everything. And
Right.
you know,
You're
and,
like, great. And
right.
no,
And
no
yeah,
to
and it
a few
was
of those things. Like, that's
right.
just
We
too
had
much.
to
But
start saying
Mhm.
no to a few
Mhm.
things if it didn't
Mhm.
make sense. But, you know, there were things too that I thought was really exciting, you know, with an event that I've helped plan, bringing up the idea of how do you raise money effectively when it's a small event and it's a small community. And I was able to bring some of my past experiences from different organizations
Mhm.
I'd been involved with in the Fargo-Moorhead area. And, you know, we ended up like doubling the amount of money that they had raised previous year when we hadn't been thinking this way, you know, so it's just things like that. And that money stays here in the community to help people who are dealing with some kind of a medical challenge or a life situation that they weren't expecting, you know, and that when you know that money that you help raise is going to your neighbor down the street, that says something, you know, that means something.
It does. And that's one of the things, right? It's not just that when I talk about like imprinting ourselves, it could just be intellectual capacity.
Yeah.
You know, like intellectual capital, like we bring our outside experiences back. And so
Right.
I want to encourage small towns to be sure that we're not closed off to that.
Right. Yep.
Because I
yes.
get that it can be hard. You know, it can be
Right.
hard. You feel like some of it is approach. I'll say when I first came back here, I very much was like, but I know things. I know things. You should listen to me. And that's not the way to do it. Like you've got to
Right.
almost listen more than you talk to just
Yes.
really understand and get the lay of the land and figure out to where the best of yourself is gonna
Yep.
land and where it's
Yep.
going to actually reap the most results.
Right.
That's a challenging thing too. But I think just like recognizing the incredible power that we have if we've gathered any outside life experience that you can bring back, and the things you can influence, even if it's a small nudge.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
And like you said,
it's
too,
really
it's
amazing.
the importance of listening when you're in a small community, because small communities do have, unique challenges. You know that about Oaks and other communities. Turton has its challenges too, but I think, like you said, it's about the approach and making sure that you have listened enough to understand that there is maybe an issue or a challenge that you and your specific skills can address. Because I think, like in that example I just mentioned, if I had come at that organizing group the very first time I sat down with them to talk about this event and been like, here's how we should do it, here's what I think we need to do, and here's how you should get sponsorships.
You haven't been doing a good enough job. That's all they hear. Like, that's all they hear.
That's just not very compassionate either. These are people I've known my whole life, that I'm not going to say that to them. So it was to make sure that I understood how the committee and the planning of that event happened before I said, well, I think there's an opportunity here. Here's maybe a way to approach it that's different, but it could yield something bigger and better. So,
yeah. Oh, I love it. Danielle, it's been so fun chatting with you. All I can say is that Turton, South Dakota, what a lucky little town.
We think we're pretty lucky to be here too, and to be able to do what we do, and to be able to enjoy this and be here with, close to family and in a small community where we do feel like we are able to make some kind of an impact, no matter how small it might be on a day-to-day basis.
It's awesome. We will make sure that we get all of the connections. So anywhere, if people want to read your reading, there's anything that you want to share with our audiences, everything will be in the show notes. So
perfect.
Seriously, thank you so much for joining us.
Yes. Thank you, Rebecca.